The early iron horses were great fire-breathing, smoke-belching metal monsters that galloped across the grassy plains with a long black streak that left a streamer of track in its wake. Native Americans were frightened by the beast with no legs that seemed to devour the land. But by the time the Gold Spike was driven into the Utah tracks of the first transcontinental railroad in North America, all those living in the States knew trains represented travel, commerce, new towns and cities, and adventure. America would be changed forever. One of the towns that eventually benefited from the increased use of locomotives for travel and trade was Spencer, North Carolina. As a railroad town filled with Victorian-style homes to house managers and engineers, and more modest abodes for the workers, Spencer became, at the turn of the century, a service stop for Southern Railway's 600-mile Atlanta to Washington, D.C. line. The far-off, lonely rasp of train whistles echoing through the night soon was like a lullaby for sleepy children living in Spencer. Spencer is home to the North Carolina Transportation Museum. The museum is located at Exit 79 off Interstate 85 near Salisbury, North Carolina. Motorists need only look for the brown signs for the NC Transportation Museum and historic Spencer shops. These shops aren't the kind that sell dresses, but rather places where mechanics work their magic in maintaining and repairing these iron behemoths of the rail. Pull on your most comfortable clothes and step into your walking shoes. There's a lot to see, a train to catch, and acres of trains, planes, and automobiles. The North Carolina Transportation Museum is located on the 100-plus-year-old site of Spencer Shops, Southern Railway's main locomotive repair facility between the nation's capital and Georgia. The shop buildings where steam and later diesel locomotives were repaired are now exhibit halls of transportation history. All the exhibits have free admission, but there is a charge for the train ride. Steam locomotives were the real heroes of America's railroads. The chug, chug, chug of the locomotive meant hot coal and fire were boiling the water, causing steam to rise up in the boiler and drive the rods connected to the shafts and pistons that made the wheels move. To keep trains running on this particular line, Spencer employed about 2,000 people in its repair shops. That's at a time when the town's population totaled just 2,500. Pipe fitters, carmen, painters, boilermakers, laborers, bookkeepers, engineers, and apprentices. So many people depended on the Spencer shops for their livelihood from the late 1800s through the 1940s.
This site was called Spencer Shops for many, many years. It was operated by Southern Railway and was actually started in 1896. That's when it first started. Southern Railway was just getting started, and they operated steam locomotives. And so they needed a major repair station about halfway between Washington and Atlanta. And so this fit the bill. And this particular building was the first truly large structure built here. It opened in 1905 at a cost of $500,000. In its heyday, this is where Southern Railway did all the heavy repairs of steam locomotives.
Repairmen would crawl into the belly of the black beast, the smoke box, to check for cracks. Craftsmen from machinists and electricians to blacksmiths worked on engines. Complete overhauls were done in the back shop, where an 80-ton crane could pick up a wheelless locomotive for the 30-day process. The building runs the length of 2 football fields, so panes upon panes of windows often were lit up by the light of welding arcs and coal fires, as engines and train parts were moved between thousands of workers. The cacophony of sounds from ironsmithing, cranes, hammering, workers' shouts, and the clanking giant wrenches and tools must have been deafening. By the early 40s, the Spencer High School Railroaders were fighting for a spot in the high school football conference. And the first diesel locomotive made an appearance in Spencer, pulled in, ironically enough, by a steam locomotive. Although the shops adjusted quickly to the repair needs of the diesel engine, these trains needed less maintenance and could travel further than the locomotive with less expense. As the steam locomotive was slowly phased out of operation over the next few years, it was clear Spencer's boom days were over. In 1960, all the heavy repair work ended and the Spencer shops closed. Many thought it might be the end of the rail yard and the town. But they were wrong. All aboard! Before the museum opened, the shops had become empty reminders of the rail station's heyday. Buildings were filled with rubble and exteriors were weedy and overgrown. The depot building itself was stripped bare of its paint, and only a tank engine without a face and an old trolley kept the depot company as recently as the early 1980s. In the 70s, Southern Railway began construction of a new freight car switching yard, and discussions of razing the Spencer site were underway. Soon, however, the railway joined forces with preservationists and began donating pieces of the property that would eventually become the 57-acre home of the Transportation Museum. Companies donated old locomotives and civic groups raised money for cabooses. Volunteers began renovating buildings and trains, and the museum began to take shape. The site really sprang to life in 1985, when some retired rail workers began work on an old steam locomotive stored in the old Spencer roundhouse. With a little help from the museum's NC Transportation History Corporation, the 1920s freight hauler breathed fire and exhaled smoke once again. Old Number 4 and a few renovated coaches joined up in 1987, and the first 3-mile on-site passenger rides were in business and back on track. Now, thousands of school children and tourists each year take a ride from the original 1898 Barber Junction Depot and Visitor Center. On this active and unique piece of history, they enjoy a ride that includes narration about the history of the site and its trains. Many days, it's volunteer Jim Meesemore, a former machinist at the shops, who now operates the passenger rides. Being around these trains is second nature to Jim. After all, he served the rail yard for more than 40 years.
My name's Jim Meesemore. I have spent 47 years with the Southern Railroad and Norfolk and Southern. I retired in 1986. I have been with the museum since 1986 up until today, which I believe is 16 or 17 years. In fact, I'm one of the 6 men that started the museum here at Spencer.
It's just like riding a bike. Once Jim got back behind the controls of a train, it was like he never left.
If you want to know how to run this engine, I'll show you how to run it. First of all, this is neutral. If you want to go forward, you push it forward. When you come back, reverse, put it in reverse. Just like an automobile. Then you go in neutral. Then this is the throttle. It's got 8 notches. It's got 8 notches on it. This is a selector switch which gives you the run, and this engine has dynamic braking. The selector goes from 1 to dynamic braking. Dynamic braking is reversing the current to put brakes on the engine that slows the train down. This is the horn. This is the independent brake valve that puts the brakes on the engine. This is the brake valve that puts it on the engine and the cars. This is your sand valve. Put the sand under your wheels. When it rains, you need sand.
There are numerous trained volunteers who regularly spend time at the museum and shops repairing and maintaining engines, working the grounds, or running the passenger trains. For the latter, it's particularly back-breaking hot work involving a tiny metal cab where shovels of coal are continuously fed into the boiler's hot box to create steam power from heated water, all in an area just large enough for 2 men. Dressed out in bib overalls and striped engineer caps with heavy gloves always at hand, these volunteers have plenty of reason to pull out a red bandana on occasion and wipe the sweat and coal dust from their brows. This particular engine, number 1925, for the year it was built, is a Shay engine that hauled lumber out of the Nantahala Mountains for the Graham County Railroad for almost 50 years. Dry, it weighs 70 tons, working 87 tons, with a 5-ton coal fuel capacity, a water capacity of 3,500 gallons, and a top speed of about 12 miles an hour. That may not sound like much speed in an age of supersonic jets and 100-plus mile-an-hour cars, but it was a revelation for those in the lumber industry at the time, especially when you take into account the peril of the mountainous rail route and the weight of the load being carried. In fact, riding in the Shay engineer's cab at a speed of about 10 miles an hour is, in itself, a bone-rattling experience, filled with heat, steam, water spritzes, bits of coal residue and dust, engine and equipment noise, and the whine of the whistle. Smoke belches from the smokestack. Sweat drops carve a white line down the soot on your cheeks, and you can barely hear the person next to you. But despite the noise and sweat and dirt, you'll notice these guys are grinning ear to ear. That's because they claim bragging rights to this being the fastest Shay engine around, thanks to a rail race with another Shay in the nearby mountains. Sometimes the need for speed has a price, however. While chugging along at a good little clip, a small fire breaks out in the dry grassland around the rails. A not uncommon problem with the steam locomotives of yesteryear, fires sometimes resulted in the brush when the trains reached high speeds, and the smoke made the blackest plume of all. Red-hot bits of coal fly out from the engine area and can cause grass and bushes to catch on fire. Modern walkie-talkies help volunteers both on the train and on the ground monitor the issue during locomotive runs at the museum. They all work together to put the fire out quickly before it spreads. It's one reason a hose also is attached to the train's water tank. And it gives the guy at the boiler another use for his coal shovel. Once riders get back on the ground, there are lots more trains to see, both diesel and steam locomotives, at the Robert Julian Roundhouse. In the Roundhouse, you can view more than 30 restored locomotives and rail cars, plus extensive train exhibits and a film on the area's rail history. As part of the museum and shop site, the 37-stall C-shaped building known as the Roundhouse was restored and opened in 1996 at a cost of $8 million. Today, it includes train and car displays from a Russian decapod to one of the few electric locomotives to operate in the South. In addition, there are several rail cars, including the plush personal travel cars of the Duke and Schwab families, an Army hospital car, and a U.S. mail train, complete with a hook to snag the mail bags hung out for collection at every rail stop. In fact, many of the diesel trains are still in operation thanks to dedicated volunteers like Jim. Most trains are parked in the Roundhouse, which is the centerpiece of the NC Transportation Museum. Named for Roundhouse foreman Bob Julian, who began work in 1897 just after Southern Railway began the Spencer shops, the Roundhouse was built to replace an earlier wooden structure. The reinforced concrete version was erected in the early 20s. This is the heart of the facility, where trains were dispatched for servicing and minor repairs. The exterior Lazy Susan-style turntable outside the bays is in use today for similar reasons when trains must be moved from rail to a specific bay for upkeep. Thanks to a major restoration in the early 90s, the turntable is back functioning like it did in the Spencer shop's glory days. Once again, it is a center of activity, as the raised platforms and pits on either side of the bay rails are utilized for maintenance and repairs. There's even a main repair shop at one end of the Roundhouse that allows visitors to watch as railroad retirees and other volunteers work on the old trains. Activity has returned to the Roundhouse in another way, too. Visitors to its many interior exhibits and interactive displays, focusing on rail history and the men who made the Spencer shops run. Remember Jim? But this isn't called a transportation museum for nothing. There's lots more to see besides trains. For instance, the bumper-to-bumper exhibit is located in a building across from the roundhouse. Readily identifiable by its hundreds of glass panes, the area was originally known as the flue shop and served as a repair area for the boiler flues of steam locomotives. Today, displays of actual Model A and Model T cars and trucks, 40s-style sedans, horse-drawn carriages, police cars from years past, and an early motorcycle are displayed, against settings as diverse as a miniature gas station and a realistic hotel parking lot. Intermingled throughout the displays are old-fashioned tin signs from days gone by, advertising gas, speed limits, and colas. In the master mechanic's office, housed in a building nearby, the Wagons, Wheels, and Wings display features all forms of transportation used throughout history in the state of North Carolina. An 1809 Conestoga wagon is on the move across a log and sand road. An early 20s red fire engine shows no traces of the deadly crash it was involved in Lexington, North Carolina. Just next door, you can take a break and select a few souvenirs from the museum store. Choose from striped engineer caps, model and toy trains and cars, children's books, train-shaped lollipops, cookie cutters, wooden train whistles, and much, much more.
If you look around the United States, you'll find that there are several large railroad-oriented museums. You will find outside Air and Space Museum in Washington, you'll find aviation museums that show different aspects of aviation history. But no, there's not another state in the country that will be able to show its total transportation development to the extent that we will. We are an affiliate with the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And what that means is they can borrow artifacts and some of our material, and we can borrow from them.
The site has a foundation and board of directors that helps keep special promotions, events, and fundraising in line to help pay for renovations, expenses, and expansions. For instance, visitors can rent the birthday caboose for children's parties. There are special train rides with Santa on board or featuring Thomas the Train and Rail Days activities. The museum's foundation and board works closely with the state's Historic Sites section of the Department of Cultural Resources. Together with staff and volunteers, they have developed a plan for future expansion and renovating and making use of the huge Spencer Shops building.
What's really exciting is we're going to have the total transportation story of North Carolina. Not just aviation and railroads, but streetcars and trucks and boats, covered wagons, fire trucks, a real variety. It's going to further preserve this as a preserved industrial site.
My experience here was railroading. I retired from the railroad, I retired from business, and when I came back here and started working for nothing, it was a lot more fun just to work here for nothing. Now, there's so much history here, and it means so much, and we want it preserved. The history is still being written about this place.
The past of the Spencer Shops and the North Carolina Transportation Museum is a shining piece of history. Now, thanks to volunteers and those who have helped restore the site and its trains, the future looks even brighter. There is light at the end of the tunnel.
Last stop, Spencer.